Hello, my name is Lesia Cahoot. I am a licensed spiritual practitioner here at the Center for Spiritual Living Victoria. And today I am filling in for Reverend Carrie Hunter, who actually happens to be here with us, but she has taken a Sunday off. And so today I am going to pick up where I believe Reverend Carrie Hunter was going to go and head, which is to talk about Advent. And when Reverend Carrie first asked me to fill in and said, this is what my talk title was going to be, you can do whatever you want, then I thought, no, I think that I would like to rise up to the challenge. And even though I really don't know a lot about Advent, to actually dig in, do some research, learn about it myself, and then present something to you. So I did exactly that. And I thought that I was going to actually focus more on the traditions and the things that go on around Advent. But then 3 days ago, something hit me and a different kind of inspiration bubbled up. And that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. Now, someone is still unmuted. Reverend Rachel, could you please see if there's anyone unmuted, because I can't see the screen anymore. I'm actually looking at my notes here. Thank you. So what is Advent? Advent is the period of 4 Sundays and weeks leading up to Christmas, and each week has a theme. So week 1 is hope and faith. It's followed by peace, then by love, and by joy. And because we are in the first week of Advent right now, we are in the week of hope and faith, which is actually super fitting because November, the theme for November here for us was faith in challenging times. Now, if you look at Advent according to Christian traditions, it really depends where you are, what religion you observe as to what it is that is involved. It can involve candles, wreaths, calendars with those yummy little chocolates and treats inside them, music, presents, fasting, and of course, prayer. All of it, though, is about celebrating and honoring the coming, the arrival, the birth, the advent of Jesus Christ as the Savior of humankind. Now, when I was doing my research, I wanted to learn a little bit more about the actual word Advent. And so I looked up the meaning and the origin of the word. And there's actually a lot of definitions and etymology that's going to come into this talk today. So what I found was that the Oxford English Dictionary gives the definition of Advent as the arrival of a notable person or thing, and that it stems from the Latin root adventus, which means arrival, which comes from the word advenire, which is ad, to, and venire, come. So to come, the arrival, something is coming. And to get a better understanding of what Advent means from a Christian perspective, I also wanted to look up the definition of Christianity. So this also opened a Pandora's box of, depending on how far back in history you went to, what continent you were on, what century you were in, pre-Reformation, post-Reformation. There are a whole lot of different meanings about what Christianity is about. It also depended on whether you're looking at Christianity from a cultural perspective or from a faith perspective. And if you think of it in terms of culture, I mean, there is Christianity just, embodied and exemplified throughout the entire globe. If you look at these beautiful grand cathedrals and these incredibly detailed and brilliantly executed, colorful, absolutely exquisite manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Today, though, if most of the time people are talking about Christianity, they're talking about the fundamental belief that Jesus Christ was a unique individual, an exception, that he died for our sins, and that one day he would return as our personal Savior and Redeemer. Now, yesterday, I had the good fortune of kind of listening in on the Unity Conference of Canada because my husband, Glenn, was the host. And one of the things that I got a chance to hear was a bit of a talk that was given by the Reverend Dr. Jane Simmons. And in that talk, which was so fantastic, she referenced a Richard Rohr quote. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan monk. He's written tons of books. And even though I don't know a lot about him, I actually have looked him up several times as I've been doing some research on different things, including my talk from a few weeks ago on faith. And so even though she had this amazing quote in her talk, the quote that I'm going to use today is actually from a New Yorker article that I found from February 2nd of this year, written by Eliza Griswold, and it's called Richard Rohr Reorders the Universe. And in it, this is what is written about his view on Christianity. So the article says, more conservative Christians tend to orient their theology around Jesus, his death and resurrection, which made salvation possible for those who believe. Rohr thinks that this focus is misplaced. The universe has existed for 13 billion years. It couldn't be, he argues, that God's loving, salvific relationship with creation began only 2,000 years ago when the historical baby Jesus was placed in the musty hay of a manger, and that it only became widely knowable to humanity around 600 years ago when the printing press was invented and Bibles began being mass-produced. Instead, in his most recent book, The Universal Christ, which came out last year, Rohr argues that the spirit of Christ is not the same as the person of Jesus. Christ, essentially God's love for the world, has existed since the beginning of time, suffuses everything in creation, and has been present in all cultures and civilization. What does that sound like to you? To me, it sounds a whole lot like what we teach in Science of Mind and Spirit. It speaks to the divinity of man. It speaks to oneness, and it speaks to the infinitude and ongoing creativity of this aliveness of being, of this essence of everyone and everything. Call it God, call it spirit, call it Christ consciousness, call it what you will. Excuse me, it is that highest level of consciousness, that divine ideal, excuse me, that cosmic consciousness, universal mind, source, the quantum field, whatever you want to call it, and it transcends time and space. So this goes further to talk about how Jesus was an example rather than an exception. And this is exactly what we talk about every single Sunday when we get together. This is what Dr. Ernest Holmes expressed in The Science of Mind and Spirit and all of his other books. And this is really what the New Thought movement is all about. Now, because this is talking about oneness and the divinity of man, for me, I started thinking about mysticism. And so mysticism is something else that I ended up doing a little bit of research on. So a few different definitions. According to newadvent.org, they write, in philosophy, mysticism is a religious tendency and desire of the human soul towards an intimate union with the divinity. It is about intuitive knowing and divine contemplation through love. If we look further into the origin and meaning of mysticism, etymonline.com offers that mysticism is any mode of thought or life in which reliance is placed upon a spiritual illumination, that's that intuitive knowing, believed to transcend ordinary powers of understanding. So that's, what we can reason, what we can think, what we can make sense of. And Ernest Holmes writes that a mystic is one who senses the divine presence, one who intuitively senses reality, highest and best that we have in civilization, music, art, religion, philosophy, poetry, science, etc. A mystic does not read human thought, but senses the thought of God. So because all of this was coming together, I thought that it would be amazing to bring it all together for Advent. So today, my talk is titled The Advent of Mysticism. And because week 1 is about hope and faith, I thought we could go into and remind ourselves a little bit about what hope and faith are. So according to the Oxford Dictionary Online, hope is a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen or wanting something to happen or be the case. Ernest Holmes, who was not the biggest fan of hope, says, hope is good, it is better than despair, but it is a subtle illusion and is an unconscious compromise and has no part in effective mental treatment. And basically what he's saying here is when we perform spiritual mind treatment, we know that this is a done deal in the present moment, right here, right now. We're not wishing, we're not hoping, we're not willing, we're not thinking that it will happen one day. We know this is a done deal in universal mind, right here, right now, period, end of sentence. Now, when we move on to faith, the Oxford Online Dictionary says, faith is a strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension, which is that realization, that sense of awareness and knowing, rather than proof. Ernest Holmes writes, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the substance, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is the proof itself. Faith is a mental attitude so inwardly embodied that the mind can no longer deny it. Now, here's the interesting thing about faith. When things are going well, it's likely that we're not necessarily, or the tendency anyway, is to not think about faith. It's something that we just take for granted. But when faced with challenging times, which has been the theme of this month, that's when we really start to think of or even question, what is faith? What is our faith? How strong is our faith? So I had mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I had initially thought about going a certain route with this talk, and then something happened and I was hit with inspiration a few days ago. And so this is what it was. I don't often talk about this, and I don't often talk about this in public, but throughout my adulthood, I have dealt with and experienced several bouts of depression. And 3 days ago, I experienced one of the most challenging times that I have ever faced, and definitely one of the most challenging times in recent history. And so as I sat down to write this week's newsletter, my own newsletter, and to promote the next Mystical Mavens live podcast, these voices started coming in my head. And first they were very quiet, and usually I can just sort of, thank you, scram, I'm done with you, not now kind of thing. But for whatever reason, this was a day when they just started screaming. They started screaming so loudly, they were deafening. And all I could hear them say was, no one wants to hear what you have to say. No one takes what you do seriously. You're a fraud. Over and over and over again. And so even though I knew that at my core, that these voices and what they were saying is not who and what I am, those voices were so loud, so persistent, so strong that it became paralyzing. And I ended up just spiraling into what felt like a depression. But I did have enough wherewithal to know that even though it was agonizing, it felt paralyzing, debilitating, and I could not pull myself out of that funk, out of that downward spiral that was happening more quickly and more quickly as the day progressed. I knew that this was just another evolution, another advent, if you will, of a bigger, more powerful, more confident, more magnificent expression of who I already am. Now, I had felt this kind of intensity with depression 3 times in the last 3 years. One, shortly after we moved here, when a very dear friend of mine committed suicide. The second was earlier this year, when I had written my final for practitioner studies, and this overwhelming feeling came over me where I actually experienced bodily what it would mean to fail that exam and not be able to move on with the work that I felt so called and so wanted to do. And then again, 3 days ago on American Thanksgiving, of all days. So I knew, because of being on my spiritual journey, that these periods of depression that could feel so all-consuming, that they were these periods of extraordinary growth, that it was that next level of evolution, that next level of becoming that was happening, and that it was so important to feel the feels, to feel those feelings that were making their way forward. Because if I didn't feel them, if I put them in a little box or set them aside or swept them under the rug or did something to compartmentalize them, they were just going to make their way back up at some other time in future, more profoundly, more intensely, in a way that was even less manageable. That's something that we would call spiritual bypass. So it's important to know that when going through something like that, even as intense as it feels, even as debilitating as it can feel, it is so important to honor and acknowledge and just allow those feelings to be. not to identify them, but allow those feelings to be, no matter how overwhelming it can feel, because they can tend to run the gamut. Now, as I was going through this gamut of emotions that I was feeling on Thursday, it started to remind me of what it can be like when you're on an adventure. And so here's another word that I decided to look up, because adventure has the word Advent in it. So when I looked up adventure, it comes from the Latin word adventura, which is a thing about to happen, which is from the word adventurus, which is related to the word advenir, to come. The meaning has developed and changed over the centuries, and here's where it gets really interesting. It can mean risk or danger, a trial of one's chances. It can mean perilous undertaking. It can mean novel or exciting incident. It can mean remarkable occurrence in one's life. Earlier on, though, and this is what really caught my attention, it meant a wonder, a miracle, accounts of marvelous things. And so when all these ideas started bubbling up over the last couple of days after I came out of that spiral, it really made me start to think that this adventure that I was on, this spiritual adventure, this spiritual journey, that the gamut of emotions that was being felt, it was very much like an adventure, that felt like risky and dangerous at times, that it was perilous at times, that it could, be novel and exciting, but that ultimately it would lead to a wonder, a miracle, and an account of marvelous things to come. And that just made me think, really, the Advent is in there, the Advent of becoming. And so it can feel risky, it can feel dangerous, exciting, even perilous, but ultimately what we become, that's the whole point. So that brings me to the subtitle of my talk today, which is The Adventure of Becoming. So if becoming, evolving, and expanding into the next best version of ourselves, it's so amazing, what's with all the drama and pain? Well, ultimately, ego doesn't like change. It is working super hard to protect us, really, to protect itself from this becoming, from this advent of the more, from this advent of this new, the unknown next level of beingness. It reminds me of this amazing quote that I heard a few months ago by David Foster Wallace, which says, "Everything I've ever let go of has claw marks on it." Like, what an incredible image. Like when you think of ego, it will do everything in its power. It will fight to its death, sinking its teeth and claws into whatever it can grasp to remain in control. And so that can mean debilitating pain, deafening voices, spewing limiting beliefs. It can mean that seeming inability, that paralysis in moving forward with anything, until our faith is what turns things around. And ultimately, the ego realizes there's nothing to be afraid of, because all we're doing is living the adventure of becoming who and what we truly are at our core. So I found this lovely quote by Rumi. When is there not a lovely quote by Rumi? And it goes like this: "This being human is a guest house. Every morning is a new arrival." And when you think morning, just think moment, every moment. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Treat each guest honorably. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Now, knowing this intellectually is one thing, but when those times are so dark and so intense, there can be this feeling of, I can't do it myself. And that was one of those times for me on Thursday. And so I knew that I had to connect with someone. I knew that I had to reach out. And so even though I knew that it would pass and I had stuff that I had to get done, I knew that there needed to be a shift in consciousness, and I just wasn't able to do it for myself. Now, knowing that it was Thanksgiving and knowing that most of the people that I would turn to were actually in the States celebrating the Day of Thanks, I felt even worse, wanting to reach out to someone on this beautiful, amazing day of gratitude. However, I was already in the midst of an email to the other three mystical mavens, about our upcoming podcast. And I just found myself writing what I was feeling and what was going on. One of them is a friend, and so I felt comfortable in doing that. But the other two, not as much, especially one of them. And so as I wrote and I looked at those words and I heard the voices in my head and the tears were coming and my face hurt from crying so much, all I could think was, I need to move out of this. I need to move forward. I need to step into something that feels lighter, that feels more expansive than this, because I can't stay stuck here. I can't stay, because this is not who and what I am. So I wrote this email and I deliberated for what felt like probably about an hour on whether or not to hit that enter button to send the email. But I finally did. There was something in me, that thing that is greater than any experience that I could ever have, that faith that impelled me to hit that send button and send that email. It was a total Brene Brown braving the wilderness moment of just being completely vulnerable and bearing my soul without knowing what was going to happen. And then the amazing happened. It was like my own Advent. So I reached out to these three amazing beings who are all ministers. And throughout the day, every single one of them got back to me. And I ended up having a long, very beautiful, profound conversation, very different conversation with each of them. One in the morning, one in the afternoon, and one in the evening, actually after dinner. And each of those conversations, even as we were having them, even though there were more tears and there was more pain and there was more going into, whatever darkness it felt like I was experiencing, there was also this illumination. There was this lightness. There was this shift in energy that was happening. This becoming from within was taking place just during our conversation. And then at the end of each conversation, every single one of them did a spiritual mind treatment for me, which just made me feel so uplifted, so up-leveled. It was incredible. And so to me, as I was sitting here writing notes for my talk yesterday, I was thinking, these three wise women came bearing gifts, of love, compassion, and wisdom for the advent of me, this miracle, this wonder, this new becoming, this next version of this magnificence, this marvelousness that I always am at my core. It was such a neat metaphor, for what I was writing about and just for the season of Advent. So after that entire experience, since then, I just feel so incredibly grateful to be firmly grounded back in the faith of me. I feel so grateful to be alive. And I am so, so grateful to know that even in my darkest hour, even when there's, the small I that can feel so alone and so disconnected, there was still that in me, that with a capital T, that faith with a capital F, that impelled me to connect, to reach out for support that I couldn't give myself, to know for me what I wasn't able to know for myself in that moment, and that was there for me in the most challenging time that I had felt in a long time. So this reminds me of something that Amit Goswami writes in the Everything Answer book, when he talks about science neglecting its main objective of explaining what the purpose of being human is. He writes, in quantum science, we have discovered the purpose of being human, which is to pursue, to explore, and to discover the soul, the archetypal or supramental body. And when he talks about archetypes, he talks about 8 major archetypes: love, beauty, justice, truth, self, wholeness, abundance, and goodness, with the 3 fundamental archetypes being love, self, and wholeness. And Goswami writes that when we're younger, we first discover love, and that as we move through life and we mature, we begin to recognize and discern the limitations of self and ego. And then we begin to question whether or not we can move beyond those limitations. And ultimately, through further exploration and evolution, we realize that wholeness is the key to overall well-being. Which leads me to the last quote for today, which is again by Rumi, and it's this: your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself you have built against it. So to bring it all home, Advent is really the celebration of the coming of the spiritual illumination of who and what we are. That pursuit, exploration, and discovery of the soul as we fulfill our purpose of being human. And one of the ways we allow for that adventure to unfold is to embody that mental attitude of steadfast, unwavering faith, knowing that no matter what is going on, no matter what we're experiencing, there is that in us that is infinitely more powerful, creative, and resilient than anything we could ever experience, than any barrier within ourselves we could ever build against love. It is for us to intuitively lean into who and what we are, claw marks notwithstanding, and not just once a year for 4 weeks, but every moment of every day. That's the advent of mysticism. That's the adventure of becoming our true selves. And so it is.